Thanks, Tamar. Before we begin, I did just want to thank Benjamin Lutz, Aubrey Cox-Ottenstein, Tamar Harrigan, Ben Goodrich, RL Yaffe, and everyone at YPFP who made this possible. I know that the summit has been a lot of work, and doing it virtually is no easy task, so thank you guys. And I'm really excited to be moderating the Peace and Security presentation, not only because I was the Sherpa, so of course I have a bias toward them, but also because I know that the ideas that these delegates are putting forward are evidence-based and have been extensively debated between the 8 of them over the last 2 months. And I know that these ideas represent the coming together of cultures, nationalities, politics, and ideologies. So after I stop talking, the delegates will define our track and explain some of the substantive challenges and considerations that were made in the process. And then you'll hear more about the negotiation process and our methodology. And finally, we'll close by reviewing some of the core policy proposals laid out in the communique. And so I hope you'll consider how they've integrated non-traditional peace and security issues into this communique. And you'll begin to understand why they've really widened the scope of what peace and security means to include things like myths and disinformation, food system resilience, and disaster mitigation strategies. I think they're all really innovative policy proposals, and I hope you'll appreciate that too. I do have one core observation about the peace and security track and of the Y7, and so you'll have to forgive me for dwelling on it at some length, but I find it really important. Soon after the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1965, Senator Robert F. Kennedy launched his 1968 presidential campaign. The Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in April of 1968, and you might recall that this was a period of great political antagonism and a time of great tension between working class whites and Blacks in the United States. But on the campaign trail, Robert F. Kennedy forged a remarkable coalition across demographic groups by teaching everyone that our futures were intertwined and that advances for the most marginalized and vulnerable helped everyone. It seemed on the campaign trail that Kennedy brought the words of the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. to life, that whatever affects one directly affects us all indirectly. Uplifting those who have been pushed down through our histories is so fundamental to peaceful and prosperous communities. And that core idea is fundamental to this communique in particular. And so I want to applaud the delegates here in this track for keeping that idea so central to our negotiations and to our communique. I see in this group of delegates the legacy of Robert F. Kennedy and his spirited fight for justice, equality, and peace. And so I wanted to close with one of my favorite Robert F. Kennedy quotes, because there are many, and it reads, "The world demands the quality of youth, not a time of life, but a state of mind, a temper of the will, a quality of the imagination, a predominance of courage over timidity, of the appetite for adventure over the life of ease." And so on that note, I'm going to turn to Mojan and Josh, the Canadian and American delegates, who will talk about the peace and security tracks defining our track section.
Thank you, Amber. I just wanted to start off by thanking Amber, our Sherpa, and my fellow delegates for taking the time and devoting the time over the past few months to work on this communique together. It's been a real pleasure. As Amber has mentioned, my name is Mojan Zibopour, and I'm the Canadian delegate in the Peace and Security track. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which I'm gathering and joining you all from is the traditional territories of the Wenda, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe peoples, whose presence here continues to this day. I'd also like to acknowledge that the land on which I'm meeting is of the 2 treaties, the Mississaugas of the Credit and the lands of the Williams Treaty. Finally, we acknowledge that as we're all joining digitally from different locations around the world, we'd like to thank all the Indigenous peoples for sharing their land with us. So as the Peace and Security track started to meet and discuss all of our points from our respective countries, and we began to boil down our calls to action, we realized that we were boiling them down to the following 4 topics. The first being disaster mitigation and climate security. The second was cybersecurity. The third focused on defending democracy and democratic resilience. And finally, our last one focused on human rights, gender, and inclusion. Over the next 30 or so minutes, my team and I will show our process for incorporating the common ideas of all our delegates within our track in order to create a comprehensive communique that addressed the topics with regards to peace and security that youth across all our countries were most passionate about. I'll pass it over now to my fellow delegate, Josh, who will talk through some of our guiding questions and 2 of our themes.
Thank you, Mojan, and thanks to everyone who's taking the time to listen in today. I'm Josh Goldstein, the Peace and Security Delegate from the United States. As we brainstormed and negotiated the major topics to be included in the communique, we were challenged to ask a few questions. First, when it comes to peace and security, what issues do young people care about? And second, where do young people differ from older generations? Where is there, in essence, a generational divide? These questions guided our track to a few key themes, which are evident throughout our communique and throughout our proposals. I'm going to highlight two of these themes and then pass it back over to Mojan to talk about a third. The first is next generation security threats. We focused on challenges that will be critical for young people in G7 countries and really throughout the world, not only today, but into the future and in future generations. For example, there was broad consensus among Y7 delegates in our track that climate change should be considered a primary security threat. This is an area where young people stand in unison, and studies show that young people are often more concerned about climate than older generations. Another next generation security threat is democratic backsliding. Whether it's emerging technologies threatening privacy, misinformation running rampant as we see in the current infodemic around the COVID-19 pandemic, or foreign interference putting election integrity into question, challenges to democracy are likely to persist into the future. So our calls to action on climate change, democratic backsliding, and a host of other topics are meant to reflect this view. G7 leaders cannot only care about today. They must prepare for the world of 10, 20, or even 50 years into the future. A second theme of our communique is human security. In many foreign policy conversations in G7 capitals, security conventionally refers to a nation's security, how to protect the country from foreign threats. Our focus is not only on national security, but on human security, which takes place at the level of the individual. Youth in G7 countries expressed strong support for this approach, often describing threats to peace and security that are local or domestic in nature rather than international. This led us to focus on things like food and water security and bodily protection from police brutality, a topic that today, as protests continue in the United States and around the world, is particularly important to face head-on. Black communities face discriminatory policing and violence that results from a long history of systemic racism. The Y7 will soon issue a separate public statement on this topic, which I'd encourage everybody to read. Back to you, Mojan, to talk about the third theme.
Thank you, Josh. So when the Peace and Security track began our conversations on topics we would include in our section of the communique, we were all really intent on highlighting two overarching themes that were coming up time and time again from youth in all of our countries. And these two big themes were about building resilience and promoting representation. Once we began to share all of our points and our calls to action and work these themes into these calls of action, we quickly realized that youth across the G7 hold matters of building resilience and promoting representation as integral methods to a safer and better future for all. Therefore, we decided to use the themes as an overall lens that influenced all of our topics and our collective calls to action. Furthermore, we integrated these two themes in the actual greater topics. For example, we added disaster mitigation to our climate security section and devoted our fourth topic to calls of action that address representation through inclusion in all of its forms. I'd now like to pass it over to my fellow delegate, Thomas, who is representing France in the Peace and Security track, and he will speak about the challenges and considerations that we faced during negotiations.
Thank you, Marlon. Hi, everyone. Thank you to be here. I'm Thomas from the French delegation. As Josh and Motion told you before, we first defined topics on what we wanted to work. In fact, peace and security is a very wide subject, and we can talk about every issue. In short, we have to start to the main challenge that the world faces tomorrow, then to decide our topic. The two first on what everyone agreed on was cybersecurity and climate security. But how could you manage climate change as a security issue, inputting the human security and the effect on everyday life of the climate change in the center of our discussion? For example, we declare water as a common good in order to prevent conflict because the access to water is because the access to water. We also deal with human rights, gender, and inclusion. The main challenge in the human rights part was to affect minorities not as passive people, but as active people who can and have to work in top positions and international institutions. Finally, what we preoccupy the most is to do policy and call of action that are for and from the youth. In fact, it can be quite difficult to take into account the youth when we talk about very complex subjects. So we take care to make our policy youth-oriented the more possible. Another challenge is that before starting negotiations, we were running survey or consulting experts to have feedback on our policy and to know what matters the most to the youth. In fact, every delegation ran focus group with young people, or we even consult diplomats, professionals, in order to know what are the main considerations of our generation. We successfully run this consultation process by video conference because of the lockdown in our country. We had even more time to do this consultation than in normal conditions. The true challenge was to implement and to transform into policy this feedback. This consultation process with different methods helped us a lot because it gave us some credibility and we knew for what we negotiating for the youth. Thank you. Now I leave the floor to my fellow delegate, Francesca, who is going to talk about our negotiation process.
Saturday, past 2 months, parallel to other alignment calls. Our objective is agreement, policy proposal, but rather on some of the delegates, surveys, and about the national began to propose topics in our experience that is relevant and of interest. Started by considering our community.
Hey, Francesca. It looks like we're having a little bit of technical difficulties and we're not able to hear you. So I think we should switch to the next slide and then we'll come back to this slide when we've worked out your mic issues.
Thank you. I'm Virginia Stewart-Taylor. I'm the head delegate for the UK, and I'm just going to introduce the remainder of the presentation. So myself and delegates from the EU, Japan, and Germany will present our recommendations to G7 leaders on the following 4 topics: on disaster mitigation and climate security, on cybersecurity, on defending democracy, and on human rights, gender, and inclusion. Can I have the next slide, please? So we begin our recommendations to G7 heads of state with a focus on disaster mitigation. As my fellow delegates Josh and Mojan have already outlined, the 21st century security threats we will face will be non-traditional, caused by climate change, infectious disease outbreaks, and other global crises. We are, of course, in one such crisis right now, and the severity of this coronavirus pandemic has prompted the youth in our countries to call strongly on G7 leaders to better prepare and to build resilience for any future crises, thus safeguarding our security. As representatives of the youth in our countries, we call on G7 leaders to firstly learn lessons from the COVID-19 response and embed responsible long-term contingency planning into the very heart of our government for the most likely non-traditional crises. Secondly, to recognise that international crises require joined-up international responses So we asked them to develop blueprints or plans for multilateral execution in future, which would see countries collaborating constructively and in a coordinated way to jointly overcome any international crisis. These blueprints should cover the basic functions of the global system and should be regularly stress tested for optimal preparedness. They should include plans to support developing countries to respond effectively. And in order to ensure that robust contingency planning is embedded into both the public and the private sectors, they should require firms who use public funds to adopt resilience plans that better prepare them to cope with such non-traditional crises. I now turn to my colleague Adel Ramdani, the EU delegate in the Peace and Security track, to present our recommendations on prioritizing climate security.
Thank you so much, Virginia. If we can just move to the next slide. I'm indeed Adel from the European Union Delegation for Peace and Security, and I will tell you a bit more how we tackle the issue of climate change from a peace and security perspective. We decided to put climate change at the core of our communiqué, not only because it's an existential threat for humans, but also because if you look at conflict situations across the globe, you always have a climate change factor to take into account. For that reason, we have looked at climate change from a perspective of climate change being a threat multiplier, and we have therefore taken different perspectives, including peace operations, legal frameworks, local communities, and access to resources. So as you can see from the first bullet point, let's start with access to resources. We do know that food shortages and water scarcity almost always lead to social unrest and political instability. And because climate change is likely, or should I say very likely, to disturb global food and water systems, as well as complex supply chains, our first policy recommendation is to increase the resilience and sustainability of food and water systems. So concretely, what it means is that we are calling G7 leaders to increase the level of food self-sufficiency of 30% within nations, to prioritize agroecological practices and minimize water-intensive crops. In addition to that, G7 leaders should recognize food and water as common goods that should be accessible for all. We believe that all of those policies should be pursued without compromising any individual other rights. Moving to the second recommendation, we are calling G7 leaders to make peace operations more climate sensitive. Indeed, many peace operations are just taking place with the assumption that climate change and security are two different areas, but we don't think it is the case. So we're calling G7 leaders to adopt climate risk assessment and information to all peace building activities. By doing this, we will have an action which will be more holistic and impactful in the field. Moving to our third policy, we are addressing G7 leaders to equip indigenous and rural communities with the tools and support needed to secure their rights to land and build sustainable communities. Because people in remote areas are always the first ones impacted by climate change, we think it's extremely important to take a proactive approach and ensure that they won't be left behind when we will start feeling even more the impact of climate change. Last but not least, we are calling on G7 leaders to assume responsibility for the effects of climate change and adopt the responsibility to prepare and prevent. So this framework is about managing climate security risk. This policy is also very much proactive, which is essential, we believe, to ensure that we are able to mitigate the effects of climate change in our society. This framework should also include assessment and anticipation to ensure that we have proper international action, but also coordination and alignment to ensure coherence between international climate change policy and international security policy. So looking at a topic which is not obviously linked to peace and security, I believe we managed to really go through the most important topics that we will have to face in the coming years. I'm now going to give the floor to Taka, who is the head delegate of the Japanese delegation, and we'll talk about cybersecurity.
Thank you, Adele. Hello, my name is Takahisa Ogawa. I'm head of the Japanese delegation. Next, I would like to address the importance of building a free and secure cyberspace and tackling hybrid threats. While new technologies like artificial intelligence are really beneficial for our society in many ways, but at the same time, cyber attacks are increasing challenges to democratic societies. In particular, COVID-19 has changed our life and accelerated demand on the internet, and fifth-generation mobile networks are developing, along with fast-growing artificial intelligence. So we need to take urgent action. Now, our Y7 Youth delegates have proposed that G7 countries work together to address cyber attacks and hybrid threats. We would like to call G7 leaders to take the following actions. First, to enhance multilateral deterrence against cyber attacks. We would like to negotiate specific treaties for cyber arm control and standard practices for cyber weapons during conflict. And we want to strengthen collaboration with international organizations to promote responsible state action in cyberspace. We would like G7 leaders to collaborate with the United Nations group of governmental experts and the open-ended working group. And secondly, to develop public-private partnerships. At the same time, ensure the privacy of citizens. We would like to strengthen commercial infrastructure's resilience, such as, and while at the same time, simultaneously ensuring the privacy of citizens. We would like to respect the rights to individual privacy, particularly from mass surveillance technology, which is growing rapidly. Thirdly, to strengthen cyber capacity, we would like to establish cyber capacity building program and strategies and exercises focusing on developing national cyber strategies and protecting critical infrastructures such as hospitals and financial or research institutions. We also want to establish shared rules with the involvement of youth voices, so receiving feedback from youth when establishing shared rules and regulations regarding internet norms. Lastly, to regulate artificial intelligence in military operations. We would like to particularly mention nuclear warfare, but also recognize the role of artificial intelligence in the field of facial recognition, language processing, and internet search. We hope we'll develop a profound shared awareness of these threats, making invisible visible, and taking peace-building action. Next, I turn it to my colleague, Virginia, who is going to talk about defending democracy. So next slide, please.
Democracy and to defend against attacks on our democratic values, whether these arise through emerging technologies, as Taka has already mentioned, or from steps taken by anti-democratic foreign actors. In order to ensure long-term peace and security, we advise a multi-layered approach that includes international cooperation between states, as well as a local focus at the national and community levels also. At the multilateral level, we ask leaders to explicitly call for states not to interfere in the elections of others and to ensure election integrity. To cooperate diplomatically during crises, to prevent leaders from exploiting states of emergency, to undemocratically increase their power, and to dissuade them from adopting divisive and racist rhetoric in crisis, which contributes to extremism in the longer term. To maintain backstops to reduce countries' susceptibility to exploitative, coercive economic diplomacy. At national and community levels, we request specific support for initiatives that build social capital and self-sufficiency in communities, especially for those who suffer long-standing institutionalized discrimination, and for those who are deprived of educational opportunities due to natural disasters or conflict. And finally, we call for action to tackle mis- and disinformation by improving citizens' digital literacy, by working with social media companies, and by ensuring that G7 leaders do not inadvertently contribute to the spread of misinformation. We believe these actions should be the key focus of the G7 leaders, to preserve the cornerstones of democracy and to safeguard greater peace and security. I now turn to my colleague Laura Geismeier, who is also head of the German delegation, to present our recommendations on human rights, gender and inclusion.
Thank you, Virginia. Our last, but of course not important section, is about promoting human rights, gender equality and inclusion, as Virginia just said. We are convinced that promoting equality is defending a critical human right and should be the core of each action taken to ensure peace and security worldwide. We asked G7 countries to implement the following actions. First of all, youth should be involved in decision-making in governmental as well as non-governmental organizations. Second, feminist foreign policy. Feminist foreign policy is about acknowledging local and global injustices and inequalities regardless but not limited to gender, race, age, or ethnicity, just to name a few. Feminist foreign policy is therefore an intersectional framework that demands that all foreign and security tools are used to reduce these inequalities. What do we call for? We want G7 countries to adopt feminist foreign policies. These should include evaluation and assessment of each policy decision taken based on its impact on marginalized groups such as women, indigenous groups, and children. Ensure equal participation of the aforementioned groups in foreign policy. This concerns work entry points, job promotions, diversity in leadership, and cooperations with civil society organizations. Increase efforts to invest in women and children worldwide to fight extreme poverty and to prevent conflict. And the involvement of vulnerable groups in the development of recovery strategies. Third, Article 3 of the International Bill of Human Rights states that everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of person. Given the latest circumstances, as protests worldwide continue, we urge G7 leaders to protect citizens from policing and justice systems that disproportionately target racial and ethnic minorities, and to address structural inequalities. Last but not least, G7 countries should guarantee freedom of expression and information, especially during conflicts, and protect the rights of whistleblowers. I'll now hand over to Francesca, and I hope that your mic works now and that we don't face any technical issues now.
Thank you, Laura, and sorry for the inconvenience. I will talk about the negotiation process. So the negotiations have been the focus and one of the most interesting aspects of this experience. We have met every Saturday for the last 2 months, as well as parallel conversations and a few other alignment calls between the different countries, especially in Europe. Our objective was to reach agreement on policy proposals referring to peace and security issues, and we immediately agreed not to focus on traditional topics, and as my colleague previously said, but rather on unconventional threats. The negotiation process began in April and was particularly intense and full of twists and turns. During the first few meetings, some of the delegates were still waiting for the results of their surveys and focus groups carried out at national level. So we began to propose topics that, based on our experience, research, and studies, we thought were relevant and of importance to young people. We started by considering what issue areas our communique should cover and if there were any overlaps with other tracks in order to manage our interactions with the other delegates. From the very beginning, we realized that cybersecurity and climate security should be 2 main points of our document, and so we worked on possible issues to address these 2 areas. Since we agreed to address 4 main themes, we then focused on identifying the other priority areas by relying also on the results and input we gathered in the meanwhile. A great debate emerged on how to address the issue of COVID-19 and the crisis we are experiencing. Finally, we agreed not to dedicate a specific session of our communique to this issue, but to try to find policy proposals related to it by adopting a broader approach and referring to non-traditional crises. After adopting a hypothetical classification of the general themes on which we wanted to focus, we drafted the various policy proposals and reorganized them according to that. There were many interesting points, so we started to debate with each other why we want to keep specific proposals, and we started to reorganize and merge the points that could go together. For example, there was a long discussion of our ideas on cybersecurity that fell under cyber capacity building. In the end, we managed to group about 10 proposals into one. So the main issue was trying to preserve the main ideas and not sacrifice important aspects of our proposition. The space available was definitely the main challenge we faced. On the last day of negotiations, we thought we were able to finalize the communique, and that we had finalized all the policy proposals. We were so happy that we started celebrating, confident that we had reached the peak of the mountains, but then we realized that we had overshot and that we would have to eliminate a whole page of proposals. However, after one last effort, we were able to finalize our document and consolidate the main topics that now constitute our final communique. Towards the very end, we struggled a bit to get the consensus of all the delegates on our communique because of one proposal on coercive economic diplomacy. So right up until yesterday, we negotiated with the other delegates from other tracks to find a solution that would satisfy everyone. The negotiation process has therefore been extremely complex and intense, but I think I speak for everyone when I say that it has really enabled us to better understand the priorities of young people, which in the end are very similar in all our countries. Now I think I'll go back the floor to Amber.
Thank you so much. I'm glad that your microphone was working. Everyone was able to see that awesome infographic. Francesca. We have a lot of really great questions that are coming up in the Q&A, and I would encourage, if you're watching at home, to keep sending in questions, and we'll try to get to everything. We had an interesting question about our proposal for water security and why we place such an emphasis on this. The question is, how exactly will the world continue to make water sources sustainable and readily available in order to preserve life and peace? And Adele, I'd love you to come in on this and talk a little bit, not only answering this question, but also to talk a little bit about why we prioritize this in the communique and how we address this. And then I'm going to toss it over to Tomas to lean on to whatever Adele mentions.
Yeah, thank you, Amber, for giving me the floor. I think one of the main reasons as to why water appeared on the communique is because it's very often overlooked. So we take, at least in G7 countries, we take water for granted. We use it at home, we use it everywhere, and we don't understand the extent to which water might at some point run out. And like any other resources, when you have a precious resource which is lacking, you have increasing tensions within a community or within any society. So we have to ensure that, especially in the light of climate change, where we know we will have to face more and more drought, how do we ensure that we still have access to water? And the question, the answer is actually quite simple. There is enough water for everyone on this planet, but it's just amazingly wasted in systems which are not meant to save water. So if I can maybe just quickly give different points as to how we can ensure that we save water. The first thing is about agriculture. We don't understand or underestimate the extent to which producing meat, for example, uses water and a huge amount of water. So we might also, at some extent, reconsider the way we consume and to what extent agriculture is using water. We also know that there's more and more investment on desalination plants, right, to get water from the sea and make it drinkable. So those are also investments that we see increasing. And then you have less technological approaches, less complex ones. You can look at water conservation systems, gray water systems, rain catchment systems. So there are plenty of options that we can look at to save water, especially in places which might be facing climate change the most. That would be my answer, Amber.
Something else, other talk about the recycling of water. We'll talk about the management, the overall management of water, because it's a really big issue. That's why we want to make water a common good, as Elinor Osson was a Nobel Prize concerned. But common goods mean that water don't have to be managed by a government, neither by a private company. It has to be managed by users themselves, who know what their problem, how many water they need, so that they can manage themselves and have no problem, have no issue of repartition. We sincerely think that water is a big issue. It creates war, for example, in Israel, between Israel and Gaza, but it can create cooperation between both two countries. For example, the Indus slave in between India and Pakistan creates a big cooperation between these two countries, two world countries. So we think that making water a common good is a really big issue.
Thank you, guys. I actually wanted to turn to a question about Indigenous populations, which, as so many of you know, water and potable water on Indigenous lands is a really big issue. And so the question, and I'm going to hand this over to Mojan, who has done a lot of great work on Indigenous populations and was able to bring in a lot of calls to action that focused in on Indigenous rights into our communique. So the question, Mojan, is what happens when Indigenous and minority communities are themselves considered domestic threats by their country's leader?
Thank you, Amber, and thank you to whomever shared that question. I think it's a really good question because it recognizes that another obstacle has been put in the way of fighting for inclusion for that particular group that's being discriminated against. And the main thing I would say is when you're dealing with that in a state that's already kind of going against that group in that sort of way, whatever that group that's being discriminated for, it's really, really important to not let them face that alone and be further alienated. The allies to come together for that group are incredibly important. We're seeing that time and time again. We're seeing it right now with the Black Lives Matter movement. But I think it's really important then to also draw a point from Minister Al-Mazuri yesterday, who talked about when you're fighting against or fighting for diversity and against discrimination, it's a fight that is not just a day, it's not just a week or a movement. You have to believe that you're able and willing to radically change the world and see consistency with that. So the group that's already being alienated, we really need to have allies come together because that group has a voice. They need to be empowered to have their voice heard and have their voice amplified. And we, as a group, really tried to bring in matters of inclusion in all of its forms, and be it institutional racism, Indigenous groups dealing with different restrictions to access, other minority groups dealing with restrictions to access, be it education or work entry points, or putting in calls to action to increase efforts to involve women and children. All of these things require the group that's being discriminated against, obviously, to speak up, but for allies to kind of gather around them, to have their voice that's already working tirelessly for inclusion and equality to be empowered, to be heard and amplified.
Thanks so much, Mojan. There we are. And so I think that's a really great segue into a question that was asked about how young learners and young leaders can do our job to reach out and promote human rights and promote social security. And so I'm going to give this one to Taka. Taka, I'd love for you to talk about this question and talk about the intersection of social security and human rights and human security.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the great question. I'd like to talk about my opinion. And I was a doctor in Japan and working for 10 years. And I've been a lot of places in Japan, from rural side to the big city like Tokyo. And I found that the respecting neighbor is the most important thing. And also everyone can do that. Everyone can respect others, neighbors, including person next to you and maybe the country next to your country. And what I learned through my experience as a doctor was the surprising things. When I went to work at the countryside in Japan, the life expectancy was the longest in that place. And also, Japan has the longest life expectancy in the world. So literally, it's the longest all across the countries. And I found that many neighbors brought their neighbors to the hospital. I mean, neighbors take care of each other. That would be the fundamental idea of human rights and also protecting society. So as I mentioned in cybersecurity section, the society is getting quite complicated, like lots of hybrid threats or lots of integrities or relationships. But the most important thing is, as I mentioned again, respecting each other, and it can do everyone and include everyone. I think Japan had a lot of experience through earthquake disaster, natural disaster, and every time we experience natural disasters such as an earthquake, we build social capital to help each other because no one can against natural disaster. And then we learn how to cooperate with each other, and that I believe that made Japan's life expectancy longer. And actually, there's a lot of research about the social capital, which is how respect your neighbors and the healthcare outcomes. And there's a significant difference between the places where strong social capital and not so strong social cohesions in the society. So, and also, sorry.
I just wanted to interrupt to say, Zhao Jennifer just added a really great question that interjects with what you're talking about. And she said, as a student who just started focusing on human rights and who really wants to do something for now, how can they do what's their first step into engaging with human rights?
Thank you very much. Great question. I believe the first thing is make friends. Because youth have more curiosity and honest. So it's easy. They are really good at making friends without any conflict. So I really love youth opinions and intuition to make it, and being good at making friends. And those one-by-one dialogue will affect the society itself as well. And at the same time, from society perspective or government perspective, I would like to promote to build a program to improve the social capital. So there's a research that shows if the people who deprive their living place by natural disaster would have worse outcome, healthcare outcome, and reduced happiness. So we need to consider not only individual, but take society itself as one unit of component and we need to take action not only for individual but also society as a unit. So, and now this is my last comment. And now we are facing the global world-scale challenges due to COVID-19. But
it looks like we're having tech issues.
Sorry. Oh. This is a great time to unite together and make those challenging to medicine. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Taka. Now, I wanted to shift the conversation toward cybersecurity because we had a lot of really great questions about that. Francesca, you have so much expertise in cybersecurity, so I wanted to ask this first question to you. Someone asked, what multilateral strategies do you think would be effective in deterring cyber threats?
So thank you, Amber. This is a really good question, since deterrence in cyberspace is one of the hottest topic in the international debate. In my personal opinion, I think that deterrence in cyber domain is drastically different and far more complicated than in other military domains, such as air, land, sea, space in general. Cyber weapons and cyber threats are offensive cyber techniques, which are inexpensive, easily obtainable, and also easy to be developed. Therefore, the number of groups and people able to attack by relying on these weapons and these tools is large, and the ability to deter vary on various issues and points, the motives and the levels of risk of tolerance that an infrastructure or a country has. Therefore, an effective cyber deterrence strategy should be multi-layered and should probably rely, if we are talking on general terms, on multilateral instruments. The real problem is that right now we are lacking a general consensus at international level, not between the G7 countries, on definitions concerning cyberspace, cyber attack, and in particular on the norms applicable to this particular domain. I'm referring to the use in bello or the use of bellum, but also on the general norms on privacy and topics like that. So probably one of the best solutions could be the achievement of a global framework, maybe under the auspices of the United Nations. So I'm talking about a United Nations cyberspace treaty, or something related specifically on cyber topics such as cyber terrorism or cyber crime. Of course, regional and bilateral conventions or treaty can be useful, but in my personal view, would not be sufficient. Right now, we can rely on the existing international law and instruments in order to provide a framework for peace and security in cyberspace. But I think that right now we can talk about a general cyber insecurity that doesn't lead to a cyber stability. So maybe the first effort should be acting as like-minded states that try to enforce the already agreed norms and continue to work on reinterpreting the principles for a new digital era, and maybe ideally develop some new legal customs in order for other states to exceed at a later point.
Thanks so much. Now everyone gets to see why we relied so heavily on Francesca for our cybersecurity section. So I actually wanted to turn the conversation to COVID. As everyone knows, COVID-19 has really upended our global systems. And someone said, COVID-19 has been a major threat to global security. How does our proposal address this issue? And I wanted to hand it over to Virginia to talk a little bit about how our communique brought in COVID, but also about the COVID-19 communique that has already been published.
Thank you, Amber, and a really good question on everyone's lips at the moment. So we did produce a COVID-19 statement about a month and a half ago, 2 months even, which was brought together at great pace by all of the delegates. And that contained 6 very concrete proposals as to the immediate steps that leaders need to take in order to prevent the drastic scenes that we've witnessed, but also to try to mitigate the ongoing issues in terms of the sort of economic damage that the pandemic is causing. In terms of the security threat, though, our proposal has a specific section on non-traditional crises, including COVID. So we actually think that the same systems and structures that are being broken down and disrupted by COVID-19 also apply to others. So these include things in the global system such as transport and communications networks. So it also includes the global supply chain, the production of critical goods such as vaccines, the ability to collaborate on research and development to produce medical products like these vaccines that we need, And the key here is that it needs to be a multilateral approach. We need countries to be working together, not in isolation. And that's something I think we haven't seen, that countries haven't been collaborating enough. And this is where, the G7, the G20, and these institutions really are needed, where they, in crisis, this is where they can perform a really crucial role. So a big part of our communique, not just in our track, but across the other tracks as well, is about collaboration between countries, sharing information, sharing expertise, consulting each other on decision making. And again, we see that it comes back to sort of democracy and national integrity as well to decision making. And there are criticisms that the multilateral system can be slow, but I think when countries and leaders do work together and genuinely work together, not just on paper and sort of for a TV camera, but really talk to each other, understand how they can jointly work in unison, that is how we tackle a threat like COVID. And it's not through national policies that are kind of out of sync with others. It's very much through global collaboration.
Thanks so much. We have so many awesome questions that are coming through the chat and through the Q&A section. So I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who's watching and writing in with questions that unfortunately we won't be able to get to everything because we have arrived at our final question. So someone asked what the peace and security track thought the biggest issues on achieving global security and peace were. And I wanted to start by bringing in Laura from Germany. Laura, do you want to just address this question, and then I'll pass it off to a couple of other delegates to answer this.
Thank you, Amber. What we faced during our negotiations was that crises that we can see or that we have seen in the past few years have been, or in an increasing number, have been non-traditional. Still, war and conflict exists, but more crises are pandemics like COVID-19 now. It's about climate change. And therefore, we think that these non-traditional crises not necessarily affect the security of the state, it more affects the security of the individual. And we try to incorporate in our communique that our focus should be on human security, the well-being of the individual, that all people can live in peace and in security. So I think, in my opinion, this is the biggest issues we face today.
Thanks, Laura. And Josh, do you want to come in on this question as well?
Yeah, so I think that this is a really interesting question because it gets at the process of how did we develop our communique? And in a way, it's how can we tackle all of these topics that may fall under the umbrella of peace and security in 2 pages. There's also a challenge here because we're not only representing our own views. So what do we individually believe to be the most important peace and security topics, but also what do young people throughout our countries believe? In the US, millennials and post-millennials are the most diverse generations in US history. So we're a diverse cohort with diverse priorities. Not all young people share the same threat perceptions. So one way that Y7 delegates tried to tackle this question is by conducting surveys. But then in the case of the US, for example, a convenient sample isn't likely to represent the views of a representative sample of Americans. So what we did in the case of the US is we looked to existing polls. So for example, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs conducts a yearly poll where they ask about a range of potential threats. And we looked at, in these polls, what stand out for young people. In the case of the United States, climate change and cybersecurity were 2 main issues, and also 2 issues that my fellow Y7 delegates talked about as being critical for young people in their states. But I also think that this gets at a larger question about process, or how do foreign policymakers in G7 countries develop national security policy? It's a challenge to represent the views of citizens, especially when foreign policy accountability is often not as strong as domestic policy accountability. So I think that this is a really interesting question, something that we tried to grapple with, and that I hope current leaders and policymakers in our country will also be grappling with, which is looking to citizens to rank different priorities.
Perfect. Thanks, Josh. Mojan, it looks like you want to come in.
Yeah, definitely. I think to Josh's point, we also all had a responsibility to represent the youth in our respective countries or the EU. So we all made a really big effort in doing so and in making sure that their voices are heard as well throughout the creation of the communique. And I know for Canada, Canada is a very big country with a lot of diversity, and the Canadian delegation really made it an effort to not only have the surveys, but also to hold focus groups and to understand what was most important and the issues that youth felt were most important and weren't being addressed enough across the country in every province and territory. So that was a really important part of making sure that we are accountable to them and for the many incredible achievements that immigrants and youth citizens have made in Canada, that their voices are also equally heard in the communique and that their interests are being shown, and that we all came together to make sure that the points that we did put, because as many people have mentioned, including Francesca, we had a lot of points that we needed to boil down, and that we kind of chose the ones that really encompassed what youth are interested in seeing in the years to come.
Great, thanks so much. It looks like we actually have a little bit of time for one more question. And this is another big question, right? The question is, if climate change is not actively addressed, what could be the consequences for global peace and security? And I'd love to hear a little bit more from Adele and Laura, who contributed a lot on our climate change, the climate change section of our communique, for you guys to come in whatever order you choose.
Sure.
Okay.
So I can go ahead, it's fine.
Right.
Go ahead, take it.
What's one of the biggest threats of climate change is that people can't live in peace anymore because they don't have enough food, they don't have water to live on, and maybe forced to move, or they get displaced. They don't have any opportunity to live in their country or respective region. This is also, as mentioned earlier, something about human security. Climate change doesn't necessarily affect state security, but the well-being of the individual. So consequences of climate change could be that because of water or food scarcity, for example, conflicts can arise, and because of that conflict, people are forced to leave their homes.
And maybe to build up on that, I think a good way to grasp the effect of climate change, if we don't act, is just to look at COVID-19. How one systemic event can have consequences over the system. And this is what the 21st century globalization looks like. We have managed to have a very efficient system, and we have managed to get many people out of poverty because of that system. But on the other hand, we have ensured productivity at the expense of resilience. And this is the big problem with climate change, is that when you have coastal cities that might be flooded a few decades from now, when you have even nuclear plants, which are the cause that can be flooded, when you know that many regions of the world can have extreme weather, forcing hundreds of millions of people to move and to go north. All of that is going to have systemic consequences on the systems that we are relying on. So I think the answer to climate change is twofold. We have to have top-down answers, reducing CO2 emissions and ensuring that we move away from fossil fuel-based energy. But also we need to build from the bottom, because those are the communities that we have to face climate change to start with. So keeping this in mind, keeping the systemic effects that are going to affect us, we have to make sure that we have communities that are resilient to the effect of climate change. It goes, as Laura said, from food and water systems, but also from community building, increasing social capital, and those kind of activities that can ensure that when a big crisis occurs, such as COVID-19 or a climate change effect, people come together instead of just being divided.
Taka, it looks like you're ready
Okay.
to speak up. Yeah.
So I'd like to just add one comment in addition to Adele's and Low's comment. It's also about the earthquake example from Japan, and some people are deprived from their house due to the earthquake, and it also means deprive their identity. So the place is quite important to make identity, not only for like just place to live. So we really have to we really have to respect the place where they live, and those populations are usually vulnerable in terms of climate change because of the floods or heightened sea levels. So that's also important, and it is shown in Japanese experience. Thank you.
Thank you. So I wanted to send over a question to Tomas, who is from the country that has made civic engagement so famous. The question is about democracy, civic engagement, civic organizing, and protest. They said, civic engagement is also a factor for peace in a country as it allows citizens' voices to be heard. What do you all see as the proper way for government to react and respond to civic engagement, and especially talking about civic protest? And they added that they often see mass demonstrations, but a lack of government response, which probably adds to the stress and frustration that people are feeling. So should there be a policy that shows that they're addressing the voices that are heard? Or how do we manage civic, how can we promote civic engagement and make sure that there's a response from governments on it?
Thank you, Amber. I think it's a really good question because the democracy of countries give us the right, the freedom of expression right, give us the right to tell them what we think, to tell them what we want to them. So I think every youth, every citizen has to be engaged in the democracy in order to make the world better, including the youth. I think, to be very short, I think it's the essence of the U7 or the U20 is to promote the voice of youth, but who know who know what they need, what they want, and to express to leaders what the youth in general don't want, and to build a better future. So to finish, I will encourage all the youth that are listening today to be involved in such organizations such as IGFPP or whatever organization, to be involved and to be listened by government to build a better future.
Thanks so much. I want to ask another question about democracy that someone brought up. Someone asked, how can G7 nations ensure the international commitment to the democratic process without threatening the integrity of recognizing the government of each nation? I want to push this to Adele, but I'd love for another delegate or possibly Adele to talk about how we integrated election integrity and election security into our communique.
Hello, Fernando Vizca here joining the meeting.
Thank you so much for joining us. We'll turn to you in just one moment. I'm glad you're connected.
My pleasure.
Amber, I can respond on the question about election integrity. So we've seen a number of examples of interference through cyber means, whether that's through foreign actors or within countries that pose a real threat to democracy and the way that our leaders are elected, and therefore the mandate, the term that they can run. And in our communique, we have specified that we want leaders to act as role models and really try to influence others not to do this. But it also takes a very important approach of enhancing the security of our cyber systems at the same time. So it's a two-pronged approach, really. So we need to be setting a good example. We need to be working with social media companies to ensure that they have the fact-checking tools cracking down on the bots that might be involved and being used in this way to influence elections through communications campaigns. But we also need to be doing it the soft power way, so using our diplomatic relations with countries to get them on board. And I think this comes back to the question as well of how G7 nations can ensure commitment to democratic process without encroaching on each other's integrity. And this is really dialogue, I think, and through respect that everyone has their own national processes and different styles of democracy, but by showing willingness to communicate and work together, that builds a common connection between countries that then makes it harder to engage in these anti-democratic practices. It's very much harder for two friendly nations to then interfere in each other's elections. So it's really about building relations and using that as a good that can influence so many other aspects and so many other threats. It's all through cooperation and international